Every morning, Grace Johnson woke up before the sun to serve a family that never saw her, and every afternoon, her daughter Leah hid in silence just to be near her. But everything shattered the day Grace was accused of hurting the billionaire's daughter, a crime she didn't commit. Handcuffed in front of the child she fought to protect, she said nothing, but Leah screamed. On the other side of the glass, Emily cried for the only woman who ever truly cared for her. In a world built on silence, two little girls dared to speak, and what followed, no one was prepared to face. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about injustice. It's about the kind of love no courtroom can understand. Leah had always thought mornings were predictable. Her mother's quiet footsteps before dawn, the whispered prayers she thought Leah couldn't hear, the hurried packing of lunches for a daughter she'd have to leave alone while she worked at the Whitmore mansion. But that morning split her world clean in two. When the black and white police cruiser rolled to a stop at the curb, Grace stood still on the marble steps of the mansion, still wearing her uniform shirt with the faded name tag. She had known humiliation before. Snide remarks from socialites, Richard's clipped orders, but never this. Two officers moved toward her with practiced efficiency, reading out her rights in flat tones. Grace didn't look at them. She looked at Leah, standing barefoot at the edge of the driveway, clutching the strap of her worn backpack. Her face was steady, but her eyes asked questions no mother wanted to answer. Grace thought of explaining, denying, fighting, but every word seemed useless against the weight of accusation. She turned her palms upward, almost to surrender, and allowed the cold metal to bite her wrists. This was the moment Leah's childhood would fracture, though neither of them yet knew how deep the break would go. Richard Whitmore emerged from the mansion's front door, as if he'd been waiting for this performance all along. His navy suit was perfect, his tie straight, his eyes calculating. "Take her away," he said, not to the police, who didn't need his permission, but to the invisible audience he always imagined. Behind him, a nanny tried to hold Emily's shoulder, but the little girl twisted free and peered out from the doorway. Her blonde hair was still unbrushed, her pajamas creased. "Daddy!" she whispered, but Richard didn't turn. He was watching Grace, savoring the tremor in her fingers as the handcuffs locked. He thought it looked like guilt. Grace kept her gaze low, refusing to give him what he wanted. Leah, however, saw everything. The way his mouth tightened with satisfaction, the faint smirk he couldn't quite hide. She remembered all the nights her mother came home late, exhausted, but still asking about her homework, still saving a corner of her meager paycheck for Leah's school trip. And now, because this man had pointed a finger, those sacrifices were nothing. Leah wanted to run to Grace, to stand between her and the police, but her legs felt nailed to the ground. The officers began leading Grace toward the cruiser, but Leah's voice cracked through the still morning. "She didn't do anything," she shouted, the words ripping from her throat raw. "I was there. I saw what happened." Her protest was so desperate, it startled one of the officers, who glanced back at her, then quickly away. Richard's head snapped toward Leah, his eyes cold as steel. "Keep that child back," he ordered someone, no one in particular. A housekeeper tried to place a hand on Leah's shoulder, but she shrugged it off violently. "Stop lying!" she screamed at Richard, tears streaking down her face now. "You know she didn't hurt Emily." Grace stopped walking for a moment, twisting her wrists against the cuffs to look at her daughter. "Leah, baby, go home," she said softly, the calm in her voice almost breaking her. "Please go home." She wanted to memorize Leah's face, the fierce set of her jaw, the way she stood small but unyielding in the driveway. Grace swallowed the lump rising in her throat, knowing any display of emotion would be painted as guilt. She turned back toward the car, but Leah's cries followed her like an echo she couldn't escape. Inside the cruiser, Emily sat pressed against the far door, her knees drawn up, her teddy bear half slipped from her grasp. She had begged to go with her father that morning, but the nanny had brought her to school instead. Now somehow she had ended up here, a witness to a scene she didn't understand. Her eyes darted from Grace to Leah, confusion and shame mixing in her small face. Grace saw her through the window and, for the first time since the officers arrived, her composure cracked. She leaned slightly toward the glass as if she could speak without words. "Don't be afraid, baby. Tell them the truth." Emily's lips trembled, but no sound came out. Richard appeared at the car window, his presence looming, and Emily shrank back. Grace straightened again, forcing her face into a mask of dignity. She would not let Richard see her beg, not even silently. She had loved his daughter like her own for 3 years. Now she needed that same child's voice to save her. But as Emily stared down at her teddy bear, her silence was louder than Leah's cries. Leah, still in the driveway, clenched her fists so tightly her nails dug into her palms. "You're lying," she shouted again, her voice cracking. "You're taking her away because you're scared of the truth." Richard's jaw tightened. "This is not your concern," he said coolly, the words slicing through the air. "Go back to whatever hole you came from." It wasn't just insult, it was dismissal, the same erasure Grace had endured for years. Leah stepped forward, trembling but defiant. "She's my mom," she yelled. "She's all I have." One of the officers hesitated, glancing between Grace and Leah, then at Richard. But no one moved to stop what was happening. Grace turned her head slightly, enough for Leah to see the tears she was holding back. "Leah," she said again, more firmly now, "go home." Her voice wavered on the last word, but she forced herself to keep walking, climbing into the cruiser without resistance. Leah's throat burned. She wanted to run, to pull at the doors, to scream until someone finally listened. But all she could do was watch as the door slammed shut between them. And so it ended as it began. Grace sitting handcuffed in the back seat, silent, Emily beside her with tears sliding down her cheeks, and Leah outside the window, invisible to the adults who had decided this was justice. Grace looked once more at her daughter through the glass, her eyes saying what her mouth could not, "Be strong. I'll come back." Leah pressed her palm against the window, though it was useless. Grace's hands were bound, she couldn't reach back. Richard stood a few steps away, arms crossed, his expression a portrait of victory, like a king surveying conquered land. But his eyes flicked briefly to Emily and then to Leah, and for a second, just a second, something unsettled flickered there. Leah caught it. She would remember it. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb, Leah's scream rose again, hoarse and raw, a child's protest thrown at a world too big to hear her. "She didn't do it," she cried. "I saw! She didn't do it!" Her voice chased the car down the street until it disappeared. In the back seat, Grace closed her eyes, holding on to the sound, the only proof left that someone still believed her. Leah walked back through the side entrance of the Whitmore mansion as if the act itself was wrong. Her sneakers were soaked from the dew on the grass, her backpack slumped off one shoulder, and her throat was still raw from yelling. No one stopped her, not the driver, not the gardener, not the housekeeper who saw her slip around the corner. To them, she was just a shadow now. Grace had told her to go home, but this was the only home she had, even if it never truly belonged to her. Inside, the silence wasn't peaceful, it was punished. Leah crept down the narrow back stairs like she had done 100 times before, careful not to creak the old wood beneath her feet. When she reached the basement door, she paused. Her hand hovered over the knob. She didn't know what she expected, a sliver of light, a voice calling out her name. But when she turned the handle, it refused to give. Locked. For the first time in 3 years, the room where she and Emily built castles out of chair legs and linen sheets was closed off like a secret. The doorknob felt colder than it should have. Leah pressed her forehead to the wood and breathed. That basement had once been the only place where Leah forgot she was the maid's daughter. Grace would work long hours upstairs, and while the world turned slowly and indifferently above, Leah and Emily turned that forgotten space into something golden. Old blankets became royal robes. A broken mirror was their looking glass to another world. The corner under the laundry chute was a magic tunnel that led to imagined forests where no one was rich and no one was hiding. But now it was over. Someone had come down after Grace was taken, maybe Richard, maybe one of the staff, and locked the room like you'd seal off a crime scene. Leah sat on the step and hugged her knees. Her stomach churned, not from hunger, but from helplessness. She could still hear Emily's laugh echoing in her head, high, full of mischief, real. Now she didn't even know where Emily was. Probably upstairs, locked in some room just as tightly. Only her walls were lined with silence and expensive wallpaper. Leah wondered if Emily remembered anything. If she still wanted to. A house full of people, and both of them had been erased like chalk from a slate. Hours passed. Leah stayed curled on the steps as the house moved around her, unaware or uncaring. Someone vacuumed upstairs. Phones rang. A blender whirred. None of it touched her. Eventually, she stood up and made her way toward the back pantry, the place where she sometimes hid when Grace was too busy to watch. She stole a pack of crackers and a juice box, eating slowly, methodically, like every bite was borrowed. Then she slid behind the washing machine and curled up on a pile of clean rags, the closest thing to warmth she could find. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the arrest, but she stared blankly at the crawlspace vent, whispering questions to herself. What happens now? Will they come for me too? Where is Emily? The worst part wasn't the fear, it was the feeling of being forgotten. Grace had always said, even when we're quiet, we matter. But in this house, silence was treated like permission to disappear. Leah pulled her jacket tighter around her and tried to pretend it was her mother's arms. But her mother wasn't here. Her mother was behind bars, accused of something Leah had seen with her own eyes not happen. Upstairs, Emily was being dressed by hands she didn't recognize. A woman with long red nails brushed her hair too hard and said things like, "Smile when your father comes in," and "You'll thank him one day." Emily kept her lips closed. She had spoken too much already, the night she told the school nurse she had fallen. It wasn't a lie, she had fallen, but now her whole world was built on the parts she didn't say. She missed Grace. She missed Leah. She missed the smell of cinnamon when Grace baked apple slices in the microwave and called them princess treats. She missed how Leah would tap her arm twice before every whispered plan. Ready, ready. But she had been told, firmly, that none of that was real. She was just the maid, her father said. She's gone. You don't talk about her anymore. Emily didn't argue. She just nodded and swallowed her grief like a pill. But in the pocket of her cardigan, she clutched a crumpled piece of paper, a torn corner from Leah's old sketchbook, with 3 childish words scratched hard into the paper. I believe you. She hadn't shown it to anyone. She never would. That note had come the night before everything fell apart. Leah had slipped it into Emily's pillowcase, afraid they'd be caught talking after lights out. Emily had read it 3 times before hiding it in her sock drawer. She didn't know then how much those 3 words would matter. After Grace was taken, after Richard had forbidden her from asking questions, after the new therapist started prying, Emily would lie awake with the note pressed to her chest. I believe you. It wasn't just a message. It was proof that someone remembered, that someone else had seen how Grace cared, how she kissed bruises and warmed soup, and knew when Emily was faking a stomachache just to get a hug. Now, even though Leah was locked out of the basement and Emily was locked in her room, that note was the bridge that still connected them. It didn't erase the fear. It didn't make Emily speak, but it gave her something to hold on to. And holding on was everything when the adults in your life were so quick to let go of what mattered. With her mother behind bars, Leah returned to the suffocating basement where she had once spent countless afternoons, hiding from the world above. She ran her fingers along the edge of the basement door again, hoping something had changed, but the knob still refused to turn. She pressed her ear against the wood, as if she might hear an echo from the past. Emily's giggle, the creak of the laundry chute, Grace's voice calling them for dinner. Nothing came. Richard had locked that room the same way he tried to lock away the truth. Clean, quiet, final. But Leah knew that truth didn't disappear behind doors. It sat in people's pockets, written on torn notes. It burned behind shut lips. She slid back down the steps, curled into herself, and whispered the same 3 words again, over and over, like a spell she refused to let die. I believe you. Somewhere above her, in a room with no toys, no grace, and no laughter, Emily whispered the words back into her pillow. The basement was dark. The house was silent. But between 2 children separated by class and lies, something fragile yet unbreakable remained, a promise written in shaky pencil that neither of them would forget. Grace sat on the edge of the cot, her back straight, hands clenched in her lap, as if posture alone could keep her from unraveling. The cell was barely wider than a hospital bed, but it wasn't the size that got to her. It was the stillness. Out there, in the world she used to belong to, time had structure, meals, chores, school pickups, laughter between shifts, Leah's bedtime stories whispered with one eye on the clock. Here, time melted. She found herself drifting back into memories, not because she wanted to, but because there was nothing else to do. She remembered the first time she walked across the Bronx with her resume folded in quarters in her back pocket. Leah, just a toddler, strapped to her chest in a carrier bought second-hand. People looked at her like she was already defeated, but she wasn't. Not then. Not when she skipped meals to keep Leah fed. Not even when a manager at a luxury building had told her to try housekeeping instead of reception because you've got the arms for scrubbing. She'd taken it, because back then, survival meant swallowing pride, not choking on it. But here now, in this cell, survival was something else entirely, holding on to dignity in a place built to strip you of it. She replayed the morning of her arrest like a broken record, not because she didn't remember every detail, but because she couldn't let herself forget. She had always known her place in that mansion, knew how to fold the sheets without creasing the seams, how to disappear when Richard brought guests, how to smile politely when Emily reached for her hand, but pretend not to notice when Richard's eyes narrowed in disapproval. She knew how to endure. But she had never expected betrayal to come not with screaming, but with silence. His silence cold and calculated as he watched her being led away in handcuffs. Grace had not even been allowed to hug Leah goodbye. She had only managed to mouth, "It's going to be okay," but she wasn't sure if her daughter had believed her. She wasn't sure if she believed it herself. The charges weighed on her like a stone in her chest, not just because of what they meant legally, but because of what they meant about her worth. How quickly a lifetime of sacrifice could be erased by one man's version of a lie. That was what prison truly was. Not walls, not bars, but the feeling of being reduced to a single false headline. Across the city, in a dining room big enough to host 10, but always set for 2, Emily sat with her fork untouched, pushing steamed carrots around her plate. The nanny tried to coax her into eating. "Just 3 bites, Emily, then we can go back to your room." But the girl didn't respond. She wasn't trying to be difficult. She just didn't see the point. Her father was always gone before breakfast and never returned before she was asleep. When he did appear, it was to attend meetings in the study or make vague promises like, "We'll have dinner this weekend, I promise," before disappearing into another phone call. Emily had started counting the number of consecutive days she didn't hear him speak her name. She was up to 11. Sometimes she wondered if he remembered how old she was. On her last birthday, Grace had been the one who baked a tiny cake in a mug, humming off-key and letting Emily choose the candle color. Richard had given her a signed card by his assistant. Emily hadn't even opened it. Now, without Grace, the house felt like a hotel with bad service and no checkout date. The emptiness was louder than any argument could have been. Leah, too, was learning the shape of absence. Not just the absence of her mother's touch or her steady, reassuring voice, but the absence of security. Each night, she slept in a different corner of the mansion, never knowing if someone would finally tell her to leave for good. She had started hiding behind the big armoire in the laundry room. No one checked there. She had a pillow she'd stolen from the guest suite and a box of dry cereal she rationed like treasure. She was 10, but she felt older, harder. Each day, she thought about the last time Grace had brushed her hair, how her mother's fingers always paused near the base of her skull, the way she'd hum when there were knots, as if the melody could make it hurt less. Now, Leah's hair was matted. She tried to untangle it herself, but her arms weren't long enough to reach the back. Emily had once done it for her in their basement kingdom, giggling about becoming hairdressers when they grew up. That kind of dreaming seemed dangerous now. In this house, in this moment, dreams belonged to the powerful, and Leah had learned all too clearly what it meant to be invisible. Grace spent her afternoons in the detention center library, not reading but watching the other women pace, some with rage, others with resignation. Watching the guards bark orders like they were training dogs. Watching herself, reflected faintly in the glass of the vending machine, trying to see if she still looked like someone her daughter would run to. She wrote letters to Leah she wasn't allowed to send. Pages filled with apologies and stories, reminders that love didn't disappear just because bars did. She folded them into tiny squares and kept them in the lining of her blanket, whispering each word to herself like a prayer. Leah, brush your teeth, eat something green, don't trust the quiet. It lies. She remembered a moment when Emily had once called her Mama by accident. Richard had snapped, "She's not your mother," but Grace had only smiled because for a second someone had seen what she gave, what she was. Not just a worker, not just a witness, a caretaker, a lifeline. Now the state called her a suspect, a threat, a danger to a child she loved as her own. That was the sharpest cruelty, being punished not for what she did, but for daring to mother someone the world said she didn't have the right to. And Emily, sitting on her bed with that crumpled note still hidden in her sock drawer, began to understand the shape of truth. It didn't always come in speeches or statements. Sometimes it lived in silences, in gut feelings, in memories that returned without being invited. She remembered how Grace never raised her voice, even when Emily spilled juice on the silk rug or asked for a fourth bedtime story. She remembered Leah's fingers grabbing hers under the covers when thunder cracked outside. None of those memories matched the words the adults around her now repeated like mantras. It was a mistake. You're confused. That woman is gone. Emily was starting to realize the world wanted her to forget, but forgetting felt like betrayal. She didn't know the full truth, only what she had seen, what she had felt, but that was enough. Enough to doubt the adults who had failed her. Enough to question the man who called himself her father, but never once knelt down to see her eye to eye. Grace had. Leah had. And now they were both gone, and all that was left was a lie being polished to look like fact. Inside that cage of steel and silence, Grace relived every version of herself, young, scared, desperate, hopeful, and wondered which one the world had truly seen. In a mansion across town, Emily sat at a dinner table made for 10 and felt more alone than she ever had before. Leah, wedged behind the laundry room cabinet, clutched her knees and stared at a vent in the wall, whispering made-up stories to herself so her thoughts wouldn't turn dangerous. And in each of their separate corners of the city, what connected them wasn't blood or name or legality. It was absence. The absence of a mother who could stay, the absence of a father who could see, and the knowledge that sometimes the deepest wounds weren't carved by cruelty, but by neglect dressed in tailored suits. Neither Emily nor Leah had ever had the mothers they deserved, or the fathers they were told to trust, but they had each other, and somewhere inside them, they both carried the quiet, stubborn belief that maybe, just maybe, love didn't need permission to be real. The fourth session began like the three before it, with silence. Emily sat on the far end of the couch, her sneakers tucked beneath her, arms folded tight across her chest, like she was trying to shrink away from the world. Across from her, Dr. Harris didn't push. She never did. She would begin with a soft, "Good afternoon, Emily," and then say nothing more. The room wasn't decorated with toys or bright colors like the ones in the books about child therapy. It was calm, plain, respectful. Dr. Harris understood that Emily wasn't a child who needed to be distracted. She was a child trying not to drown in things she couldn't name. For 3 sessions, they had played a silent game, Dr. Harris waiting, Emily staring at her shoes, blinking slowly like she was somewhere else. But something shifted today. Maybe it was the weight of the air. Maybe it was the memory of Grace brushing her hair into a soft braid. Maybe it was the way the grown-ups had started whispering louder when they thought Emily couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it cracked something open. Dr. Harris noticed it immediately, not a change in posture, but in the eyes. Emily's gaze broke away from the floor and wandered toward the window. Manhattan looked heavy outside, the sky a flat gray, but Emily didn't seem bothered by it. "Do you know what Grace used to call me?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first sound she had made in 4 hours of therapy. Dr. Harris didn't respond immediately. She let the question float, honoring it. Emily spoke again, quieter this time. "She used to call me Little Star. She said that when I was scared, I should look up and find one in the sky, because stars don't get smaller when it's dark, they get brighter." Her chin quivered slightly. "She told me that before bed, every night." Dr. Harris leaned forward an inch, not wanting to break the fragile spell. "That sounds like someone who really cared about you," she said softly. Emily nodded, still watching the sky. Her hands tightened into fists, then loosened again. "She didn't hurt me," Emily said. The words weren't shouted, weren't even fully confident, but they were true. She looked directly at Dr. Harris now, her voice slightly steadier. "Everyone keeps saying she did, but she didn't. I fell. Leah told me to stop, but I kept jumping down the stairs. And I fell." It poured out in pieces, each sentence like a breath she'd been holding for days. "I told my dad Grace pushed me, but that's not what happened. I didn't want her to get in trouble. I didn't want him to get mad." She shook her head, her jaw tightening. "He doesn't really see me anyway, but when he does, it's always with that look, like I ruined something." Dr. Harris didn't write anything down. She knew this wasn't the moment for files or notes. It was a moment that might vanish if mishandled. "You were scared," she said gently. "That makes sense." Emily blinked fast. "Grace called me her little star," she repeated, as if afraid the memory might vanish. "She made me soup when I was sick. She stayed with me when I had nightmares. She didn't hurt me." Outside the courthouse therapy wing, Leah sat on the edge of the concrete planter, legs swinging off the side, a sandwich wrapped in a napkin balanced on her knees. She didn't know if Emily would see her. No one told her to wait there. Grace wasn't there to give instructions, to say when to speak and when to stay quiet, so Leah listened to her gut, and her gut told her to show up. Maybe Emily would walk by. Maybe they'd talk again, or maybe not. But Leah was learning that sometimes just being there was an act of defiance. She took a small bite of the sandwich and looked down at her shoes. They were too tight again. She needed new ones. But how could she ask anyone for something like that now? The world had taken her mother and sealed off everything familiar. Still, she waited. Not because she expected anything, but because she needed to believe Emily still remembered, that their friendship had been real, that the world couldn't erase it as easily as it had erased Grace's freedom. Emily walked past Leah without a word. Her head was down, shoulders drawn in, the weight of the confession in therapy still clinging to her like fog. She wasn't ready to stop. Not yet. The words were still too new, the truth still too fragile to hold in front of someone else. But she had seen Leah. She always saw Leah. Her fingers slipped into the pocket of her hoodie as she walked, gripping the small, folded paper she'd carried for days. She let it fall to the pavement near Leah's feet, not breaking stride. She didn't look back. Leah blinked, startled, and glanced down. The note was crumpled, barely visible. She picked it up with shaking fingers and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, rushed, written in blue crayon. "Sorry, I'm trying." That was all it said. Leah read it 3 times, her throat tightening. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't even forgiveness. But it was something, and in a world that had taken so much from them both, something could be everything. Inside the therapy office, Dr. Harris sat still for a long moment after Emily left. She didn't jot down notes or call anyone right away. She just let the weight of what had been said settle. In another room, a prosecutor would likely continue spinning a narrative. A defense attorney would strategize, and a judge would sort through evidence, all while missing the softest truths. But here, today, a child had spoken, had whispered something real. The session had begun with silence, and it had ended with the one sentence that mattered more than any affidavit. "Grace didn't hurt me." Outside, Leah folded the note and tucked it into her shoe like a secret. A message kept close, waiting for the moment she could believe in it fully. Emily was still walking, her fists clenched, but her shoulders just slightly less hunched. She wasn't there yet, but she was trying. Grace sat silently in the courtroom, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She didn't raise her eyes. The people testifying spoke around her, not to her. Their voices were cautious, careful, calculated. Former staff fidgeted on the stand, their memories conveniently vague. "I never saw anything directly," one said, glancing quickly toward the row where Richard Whitmore sat. Another, a former nanny who'd only lasted 6 months, said she sensed tension in the house but admitted she didn't want trouble. Grace said nothing. The prosecution paraded their witnesses like clockwork, trying to give weight to an accusation built more on Richard's power than on proof. And yet, with every sentence spoken, Grace seemed to fold deeper into herself, as if shrinking could make her disappear. She barely noticed when the judge flipped through her notes and called a new name, almost casually. "Leah Johnson?" The courtroom shifted. Murmurs. A rustle. Grace's head snapped up. Leah stood from the back row, her backpack still slung over one shoulder, its zipper half broken. Her sneakers squeaked as she walked forward. She didn't look at the jury. She didn't look at Richard. She looked only at her mother. Leah climbed onto the witness seat with the stiffness of someone used to being told where she couldn't go. The bailiff asked her to state her name. She did, her voice trembling only slightly. The defense attorney, gentle but direct, approached. "Leah, were you at the Whitmore residence on April 3rd? She nodded. "Were you supposed to be there?" "No," she admitted, "but I was. Can you tell the court what you saw that day?" Leah swallowed hard. Her fingers twisted in her lap, but she spoke with surprising clarity. "Me and Emily, we were playing a game. We were jumping down the stairs. I told her to stop. She didn't. She jumped too far and fell. She hit her arm. She cried. I panicked." The jury leaned forward. Grace wasn't there when it happened. She came after. She picked Emily up, took her to the bathroom, cleaned her, made her soup. Her voice cracked slightly. "She held her all night, like always." She glanced at her mother again. She didn't hurt her. I saw everything. She didn't do anything wrong. A long pause filled the room. Then the prosecution approached, almost smirking. "You're the defendant's daughter, aren't you?" the prosecutor asked, each word sharp. "Yes," Leah said, chin lifted. "And you were there illegally, hidden against house rules." "Yes. So why should this court believe you?" Leah froze. The weight of that question hit harder than she expected. Because she was the wrong girl, the poor one, the hidden one. Her eyes darted to Grace, then to the judge. She opened her mouth, but another voice cut through before she could speak. "Because it's true." The courtroom spun as heads turned. Emily Whitmore had stood, alone, unprompted. Her small hands trembled by her sides, but her voice held. "She's telling the truth." The prosecutor tried to interrupt, but the judge raised her hand. "Go on, Miss Whitmore." Emily stepped forward, her words quiet but undeniable. "I lied. My dad told me to say Grace hurt me. He said no one would believe her anyway, that she was just the maid." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "But Grace, she's the only one who ever stayed with me when I was sick. She braided my hair. She made my favorite soup. She read to me. She called me her little star." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Richard didn't move, not a twitch, not a blink. The prosecutor turned toward Emily, unsure of whether to cross-examine a child contradicting her own sworn statement. The defense attorney looked as if he wanted to reach for the girl, shield her somehow. The judge leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench. "Emily, are you saying your father pressured you to make a false accusation?" Emily nodded. "He told me if I didn't, we'd lose everything. He said people like Grace don't fight back." She paused, then added, "But she did." She looked at Leah now, then back at Grace. "And she's my real mom." A single gasp escaped from the back of the room. Grace's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Her hands, once white-knuckled and clenched, had gone slack, fingers trembling just slightly. No one said anything. For once, the room had nothing to argue. Emily had shattered the mask of control that Richard had worn for years with a handful of soft, irrevocable words. Leah sat still, not smiling, just breathing deeply, as if for the first time in days she finally could. The judge looked at the jury, but no instruction came. She knew the moment was too raw, too real, too early to frame. Instead, she nodded toward the bailiff and called for a short recess. Richard remained seated, his posture straight, his hands folded like a statue sculpted to hide guilt. But his jaw was tight now. His eyes no longer scanned the room with arrogance. They darted, like someone caught in a burning room, searching for a door that wasn't there. The prosecutor whispered something to him, but he didn't answer. Emily walked back to her seat, past Leah. Their eyes met, but they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. Outside, reporters scrambled. Inside, a defense attorney finally allowed himself to exhale. And Grace, still in the same chair, still the same woman accused, lifted her eyes and met her daughter's gaze. Leah gave her the smallest of nods, as if to say, "We did it." For a moment, Grace allowed herself to believe it. She wasn't free yet, but for the first time, the world had heard the truth. The hearing wasn't over, the battle wasn't won, but the tide had turned, not because an expert testified, not because of a lawyer's closing argument, but because two children, one hidden, one silenced, spoke. And when they did, the lie began to crumble. Grace didn't stand. She didn't wave or break into tears. She just sat, letting it wash over her like a storm she'd long accepted. But Leah's heart pounded. Her words had mattered. Emily's had changed everything. They had entered the courtroom as footnotes in someone else's story. But now, the story was theirs, and no one could take it back. When Richard Whitmore heard his daughter say those words, "Grace is my real mum," something inside him didn't crack with sorrow or guilt. It didn't tremble with the weight of self-reflection or regret. It snapped with rage, pure, hot, entitled rage. He stood up in the courtroom without being called upon, knocking his chair backward with a screech, and shouted across the silence that followed Emily's testimony. "You don't know what you're saying!" His voice was loud, jarring, but not the kind that commanded anymore. It wasn't powerful. It was pathetic. "She lied to you. She manipulated you," he barked, pointing at Grace, then at Leah. "You're a child, Emily. You don't know what love is." But no one looked at him with fear anymore. Not the jury, not the press, not even the judge. His words fell like bricks into water, loud at first, then sinking fast. The courtroom didn't flinch. He waited for someone to defend him, to echo his anger, to rise in his defense. No one did. The room had moved on without him, and he was still screaming at ghosts. The judge struck her gavel once, firm but composed. "Mr. Whitmore, that is enough," she said, the sternness in her voice not theatrical, but absolute. "If you cannot control yourself, I will have you removed from this courtroom." Richard froze. For the first time in years, maybe decades, he stopped. Not because he respected her authority, but because he realized, too late, that no one was standing behind him anymore. His legal team looked away. His PR manager had already left the room. Even the court officers who once nodded at him as if he owned the building stood unmoved. The judge leaned forward and addressed the room. "Let the record show the defendant has been exonerated of all charges." Then she looked directly at Grace. "Miss Johnson, you are free to go." A breath passed through the courtroom like an invisible ripple. Then she continued with a sharper edge. "Furthermore, this court will open an inquiry into Mr. Whitmore's conduct. We will be reviewing allegations of false testimony, emotional coercion, and willful negligence regarding his daughter's well-being." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of consequences that had finally caught up to the man no one thought could be touched. Richard sat back down slowly, almost robotically, as if the strings that once animated his every move had been cut. He didn't look at Emily. He didn't look at Grace. He didn't even look at his own hands, clenched now like fists, though there was no one left to strike. The courtroom murmured behind him, reporters typing, lawyers whispering, cameras flashing, but it no longer orbited around him. He was no longer the sun in that room, just a shadow of a man who had mistaken money for meaning, control for care. His chest heaved, not with tears, but with humiliation. Not because he had lost, but because he couldn't comprehend why. Love, to him, had always been something transactional. He gave schools, trust funds, a last name that opened doors. In return, he expected loyalty, obedience, maybe admiration. But Emily had looked him in the eye and told the truth. That he had never really been there, that he didn't know her, that he didn't love her the way Grace, a woman with nothing, had. That cut deeper than prison ever could. And worst of all, it had happened in front of everyone. Across the aisle, Grace didn't gloat. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just sat with Leah's hand in hers, quietly absorbing the moment. It wasn't victory, it was survival. It was the weight of every night she'd gone to sleep wondering if the world would believe her child over a man with skyscrapers in his name. She turned to Leah, who looked up at her with a mix of exhaustion and pride, and nodded. "We're okay," Grace whispered. Leah nodded back. For them, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something unpromised but finally possible. Emily sat beside them now. Not clinging, not pretending, just present. That was enough. And Richard, he sat alone, unspoken to, unacknowledged, in a chair that once symbolized power and now only resembled isolation. Every courtroom seat had a witness, but he had no allies left. His collapse wasn't public in the way he once feared. It was private, internal, and irreversible. The room began to empty, reporters rushing to file their stories, clerks gathering documents, lawyers preparing appeals no one believed in. But Richard stayed seated. Maybe he thought staying would change the narrative, make him seem stoic. Or maybe he simply had nowhere else to go, where his name still carried weight. He stared forward, hollow-eyed, jaw tight, as Grace walked past him with both girls. She didn't look down. Emily did, just for a second, but it wasn't pity she carried in her eyes. It was closure. The kind that doesn't come from revenge, but from understanding someone will never change. Richard had used every tool at his disposal to win. Status, lawyers, lies, and he had lost to a sandwich packed in a napkin, to a scribbled note in a child's pocket, to a nickname whispered in the dark, to presents, to love, the kind of love he had never offered because he had never known how. By the time the last camera clicked and the courtroom doors were locked, Richard remained in that chair, alone. The judge's gavel still echoed faintly in the air, but it was done. He had been defeated by something he would never be able to touch or buy, not because he lacked money, but because he lacked something far rarer, the ability to see others as more than mirrors of himself. He had built buildings, but not a home. He had fathered a child, but never been a father. He had stood in boardrooms, ruled them, but failed to sit down beside his daughter when she needed him. And now she had chosen someone else. The court had rendered its verdict, but the real sentence, the one no one could appeal, was written in Emily's eyes as she walked away. "You were never really mine." Richard lowered his head, not in grief, but in quiet defeat. Not from injustice, but from a truth he couldn't rewrite. Love couldn't be forced, bought, or demanded. It had to be lived, and that he had never given. The courthouse steps were still crowded with reporters, microphones pointed like weapons, waiting for the next viral soundbite. But none of that mattered to Leah. She only saw Emily, standing at the top of the stairs, momentarily frozen, as if unsure whether she was allowed to run. The instant their eyes met, the world dissolved. Leah's backpack dropped from her shoulder, and Emily kicked off her tight black flats as she flew down the marble steps. They met in the middle, colliding with the desperate joy of two children who had been pulled apart by adults who thought they knew best. "I thought you weren't coming," Emily whispered, tears instantly falling. Leah didn't respond with words. She just held her tighter. Behind them, Grace stepped forward, arms wide open, and both girls turned into her embrace. For the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to cry in public. Not the silent, restrained tears of a woman hiding pain, but open, trembling sobs that said, "We're still here." When the press swarmed forward, someone asked, "Ms. Johnson, what now?" Grace didn't hesitate. "I'm going to take care of both of them," she said, voice steady, hand on each of their backs, with or without permission. The move happened quickly, not because Grace had the money or the means, but because she couldn't stand another night under someone else's roof, especially not a roof that once kept her daughter hidden. The new place was nothing glamorous. A narrow two-story walk-up in Brooklyn with chipped paint around the doorframe and windows that moaned when you opened them. But Grace saw none of that. She saw potential. She saw freedom. And most importantly, she saw a place where no one would ever have to hide in a basement or whisper friendship behind closed doors. Emily was quiet the first night. She kept looking at Leah like she was afraid she'd disappear again. Leah, ever the protector, never let go of her hand. Grace cooked something simple, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup from a can, but when she placed the bowls on the table and called them over, it felt like serving royalty. The kitchen was small, barely fitting the three of them, but it was theirs. Grace looked at the two girls, now seated on either side of her, and took a slow breath. "From now on," she said, voice soft but firm, "nobody hides. Not in this house." The following days were messy in the most human ways. Emily had nightmares. Leah woke up to comfort her. Grace burned the toast every morning and forgot to buy laundry detergent twice. Emily didn't know how to ride the subway, and Leah laughed but held her hand the whole time. They argued over what to watch on TV. Leah wanted cartoons, Emily wanted nature documentaries. Grace settled it with a game of rock, paper, scissors, and through it all, something quietly stitched itself between them. Thread by thread, meal by meal, moment by moment. Emily began calling Grace G. Then one day, without warning, "Mom." Leah didn't flinch. She just smiled, as if she'd always known it would happen. Grace didn't correct her. She just placed her hand over Emily's, and neither of them spoke about it again. There were no grand declarations, no paperwork signed, no headlines written. But in that tiny apartment, something sacred had begun. A family not defined by blood, but by choice. And every day, Grace reminded herself that love wasn't about having the right. It was about showing up. One afternoon, as Grace sorted through a box of mismatched utensils in the kitchen, she found an old magnet shaped like a star. It had been Leah's, part of a sticker set she once got from school. Grace smiled and stuck it to the fridge. Without thinking much, she scribbled a note on a torn envelope and stuck it underneath. "Somos familia. Aqui a gente escolhe." She didn't translate it for Emily. She didn't need to. When Emily saw it later that night, she stared at it for a long time, ran her fingers over the words, then pulled Grace into the kind of hug you don't grow out of. There were no more apologies in that house, just understanding, just being. Leah added a doodle beside the note, 3 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. One wore braids, one had freckles, one had curly hair and glasses. Grace hung it on the wall with tape that didn't match, and none of them cared. It was the first piece of art in the house. It wouldn't be the last. Some nights Grace still worried about money, about court appeals, about what the world might try to take from them next. But then she'd walk into the girls' room and find them asleep, Emily's head on Leah's shoulder, their fingers loosely intertwined, breathing in sync. And she would remember why she chose to fight. Not for justice, not for revenge, but for this. For ordinary nights that didn't have to be earned. For a future where no one was hidden, silenced, or made to feel like love had a price. Emily no longer whispered in fear. Leah no longer waited by locked doors. And Grace no longer apologized for wanting more than survival. She wanted peace. And slowly they were building it, one honest day at a time. No signatures required, no permissions granted. At breakfast the next morning, Grace placed 3 mismatched plates on the table and called out, "Girls, food's up." They scrambled into the kitchen in pajamas, laughing, hair tangled, arguing about who got the last piece of toast. On the fridge, the note remained, "Somos familia. Aqui a gente escolhe." And as Grace poured orange juice into 2 chipped cups, she looked at them and finally understood something she'd only hoped for before. Love means never having to apologize for staying. She smiled, placed the pitcher down, and joined them. In that moment, between fresh laughter, shared glances, and unspoken safety, she knew this was home. What starts as an ordinary day takes a dramatic turn when a young black boy risks everything to save a millionaire's wife from a life-threatening accident. In a split second, his quick actions change not only her fate, but his own. The next day, the millionaire appears at the boy's humble home with an unexpected offer that leaves everyone speechless. This gripping story highlights bravery, compassion, and the extraordinary ways fate connects lives. Witness the powerful chain of events that began with a simple act of heroism and led to a life-changing opportunity no one could have imagined. Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you react in such a moment of courage? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe on our channel for more inspiring stories that touch the heart and remind us of the good in humanity.